The horizon burned a harsh, relentless gold as the midday sun struck the barren ridge. Dust churned in small whirls across the empty valley below, where the skeletal remains of an old mining town stood half swallowed by sand and neglect. Jonah Mercer, the rancher who had lived alone here for the better part of a decade, crouched behind the rusted frame of what had once been a wagon, the smell of scorched metal and desert iron in his nostrils. His hands were blackened with grease and dirt, a testament to a morning spent coaxing life back into his old diesel generator that powered the arrays and automated sentries on his property. The system wasn't military grade, not even close, but it had to be enough. Today he would find out if it was. Mercer's eyes narrowed as a flicker of movement caught his peripheral vision, a shadow crossing the jagged rocks far above the valley floor. He had learned long ago that in this terrain, patience was survival. The wind carried everything, the scent of smoke, the sound of distant scraping metal, yet it never carried any comfort. He tightened his grip on the long-barreled rifle he kept slung across his shoulder, one eye scanning the ridge while the other flicked the array of solar-powered sensors blinking silently across the horizon. Every one of them had a line-of-sight blind spot, and he had mapped each meticulously. He'd spent months memorizing the patterns of wind, sand, and even wildlife that could set off false alarms. He was not a man given to superstition, but something about the stillness today set his teeth on edge. Then he saw her, a small figure, suspended from the branch of a gnarled mesquite tree, swayed slightly in the wind. At first, Mercer thought it was some kind of scarecrow or cruel prank, until the sign flapping against the figure's torso came into focus. "White man, don't forgive." The crude lettering was carved deep, the edges jagged. Smeared with dirt or perhaps blood, it was impossible to tell from this distance. His stomach clenched as he realized the weight of the scene. She was a girl, no older than 14, her dark hair whipped across her face in the wind, her body limp but not yet fully unresponsive. Mercer's mind raced. He had lived through dust storms that ripped through the canyon like bulldozers, coyotes that had learned to work in packs against livestock, and men who believed the desert was theirs to command. But this was something different. Someone had left her here as a warning, a statement, and the cruelty was deliberate. He approached cautiously, his boots sinking into dry sand, each step calculated. The ground around the tree was littered with signs of struggle-broken twigs, scuffed earth, and the faint remnants of footprints that spoke of multiple assailants. Mercer's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a relentless calculation. Whoever had done this had expected someone to find her, but he would not be the one to falter. The comm panel beeped, and he glanced down at the flickering readout. Local drones had picked up a heat signature moving toward the valley hostiles, likely checking their handiwork. He could see it in the patterns, the cautious movement, the way the dust rose just enough to betray them. Mercer knew he couldn't act alone. Not entirely. Across the ridge, a small hoverbike hummed to life, silent until the rotor blades caught the sunlight and glittered like a swarm of metallic bees. Captain Laia Voss, the nearest thing Mercer had to a tactical ally, was already scanning the perimeter through her visor, which filtered infrared electromagnetic interference and low-light visual feeds simultaneously. She had insisted on joining him after intercepting chatter about movements in the sector, a coalition of scavenger militias who had begun testing the limits of what a single, isolated rancher could resist. Her own weapons were compact, lethal, and unfamiliar to the desert folk, but perfect for someone trained to think 2 moves ahead. "Jonah," she hissed through the comm, her voice calm but taut. "We've got at least 3 vectors of approach. South Ridge, East Gully, and something moving from the northeast scrub. Heat signatures aren't civilian." He acknowledged silently, keeping his own breathing controlled. Mercer had a mind for patterns, for terrain and probability, and he began ticking through them as he moved. The girl needed extraction, but doing so exposed him to multiple lines of fire. A frontal approach risked crossing paths with whoever had set this trap. He scanned the mesquite branches, noting the angles, the length of the rope, the proximity to the exposed ridge above. The wind shifted. A faint metallic hum told him the drones had pinned the intruders' cum jammers. Mercer's strategy formed instantly. The girl was priority one. Neutralize or at least displace the immediate threat. Secure her from the tree and retreat to the safer perimeter where Laya could provide overwatch. He crouched lower, selecting a line of sight that minimized exposure while giving him a clear path to the girl dot as he inched closer. He noticed the subtle signs, scuff marks that indicated rapid descent from the north ridge, a faint scent of burnt oil and the soft crunch of sand under booted feet. Mercer recognized the type of soldiers who used improvised tech to dominate territory guerrilla engineers, capable, cunning, and cruel. Their advantage was asymmetry. His was terrain familiarity and the stubbornness that came from decades alone with nothing but survival. He glanced back at Laya. "Ready when you are," he whispered. Her response was a tight nod, barely perceptible through the visor. The hoverbike dipped slightly, repositioning to provide cover fire if needed, the rotors kicking up a protective cloud of dust. Mercer moved into the open just enough to see the girl clearly. Her face was pale, her lips dry and cracked, but her eyes flickered when sunlight touched them. She was a live dot, and then the first shot cracked. Not aimed at him, but at the tree. A projectile streaked past, splintering wood near her head. Mercer threw himself into the shallow cover of a sand dune, immediately returning fire with controlled bursts. His rifle was old, but precise. The militia's kinetic disruptors were fast but crude. Each shot he fired was measured, designed to incapacitate without unnecessary exposure. Laya's drones flitted overhead, emitting brief pulses of electromagnetic interference to confuse the assailants' coms. The intruders responded with wild, panicked fire. Mercer used the chaos, timing his sprint to the tree with bursts of low, controlled suppressive fire. Dust and heat shimmered across the desert. The distant ridges seemed alive with movement. He reached the girl's side in seconds that felt like hours. Her rope had been tied crudely, a knot that would not withstand expert handling. Mercer's hands worked rapidly, cutting it while scanning for approaching threats. "I've got you," he said softly. Her eyes widened at the sound, then blinked against the glare of sunlight. He lowered her carefully, checking for injury. Suddenly, from the northeast scrub, figures emerged, half hidden by the dunes, but moving with calculated speed. Laya's voice cut through the cum again. "Jonah, you've got 3 closing fast northeast and east gully converging. You need extraction now." Mercer's mind raced. They were fast, but they were predictable. The North Ridge descent left their flank exposed. Using the girl as bait would be deadly, yet any hesitation risked her life. He took a deep breath, assessing the wind, the cover, the angles of fire. Improvisation would be key. He would turn their overconfidence against them. With a fluid motion, he slung the girl across his back, keeping her head low. He dashed toward a low rise, using the uneven terrain to obscure movement. 3 shots cracked behind him, kicking up sand, but he timed each movement to minimize exposure. Laya's drones distracted the enemy, flitting across their sensors, their pulse jammers flicking intermittently. Mercer moved faster than he had in years, muscles screaming, heart pounding. But his mind sharpened to crystalline focus at the crest of the rise. He paused. The militia had assumed he would retreat straight to the east gully. He pivoted, using a small, sun-bleached ridge to conceal their movement, setting a counterintuitive trap. One figure slipped on the loose gravel, exposing the others. Mercer's old hunting instincts kicked in. He used the environment as a force multiplier, each shot precise. Each step measured but just as he felt the first glimmer of advantage. a distant rumble shattered the tense-era Land Rover, modded for rapid assault, barreling down the South Ridge. It wasn't meant to be seen yet. Mercer froze, the girl instinctively tightening her grip on his back. Leia cursed softly over the combs. South Ridge, incoming fast. You've got seconds. He glanced around. The terrain offered no direct cover from a vehicle moving at that speed, and he couldn't outrun it. Improvisation had to be brutal and immediate. He scanned the sand, spotting the remnants of old mining tracks, sharp turns that could slow the vehicle. A plan, barely formed, sparked. Lure them onto unstable ground, use gravity and terrain to their disadvantage. He could do it if the first wave didn't overwhelm them. Mercer shifted the girl, whispering encouragement, keeping his tone steady even as adrenaline coiled through him like a live wire. The heat shimmered, the dust kicked up by distant mules. The militia was converging, weapons raised. Every decision now carried weight. One misstep, and both of them would die. Yet in the calculus of survival, hesitation was worse than recklessness, and then it happened. The lead militia soldier, confident and exposed, stepped onto a ridge that Mercer knew had been destabilized by decades of erosion. A crack sounded, a soft, subtle warning, and the ground gave way beneath him. A cascade of sand and rock swallowing him almost instantly. His companions screamed and faltered, their rhythm broken. Mercer saw his opening. The desert itself had become a weapon in his hands. He bolted, gripping the girl, racing toward the improvised escape route, the sound of the collapsing ridge behind him like a heartbeat. Leia's drones flitted alongside, casting blinding pulses that disrupted targeting optics. Mercer knew this was only the first skirmish, a warning shot in a battle that was only beginning. But he had her alive, and for now, that was enough. As they crested the next dune, he dared a glance back. The militia had halted, regrouping in confusion, their vehicle now teetering dangerously on the edge of the collapse. Mercer allowed himself a breath, a fleeting moment of grim satisfaction. But the warning sign remained vivid in his mind, etched into the girl's past and his own. White man don't forgive. Whoever had done this was patient, cruel, and calculating, and Mercer knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that this was far from over. The desert stretched ahead, sun-baked and merciless. But for the first time that day, he felt a spark of hope. Survival was possible, but it would demand everything: tactical ingenuity, unwavering determination, and a willingness to pay the cost. He tightened his grip on the girl, scanning the horizon for the next threat, and set off toward the only place that offered even a chance of safety. A shadow flickered on the far ridge, almost too fast to see, and Mercer froze, heart hammering. Someone or something was already moving to intercept them. The game had just begun. The night came quickly, descending over the desert like a suffocating blanket, and with it, a cold that gnawed at Jonah Mercer's skin as he trudged over jagged dunes with the girl strapped to his back. The heat of the day had baked the ground into a brittle crust, and now, under the stars, that same earth became uneven and treacherous, threatening to twist ankles or break bones at the slightest misstep. Leia Voss hovered silently behind him, her hoverbike's dim lights masked by adaptive camo, keeping pace as they moved toward the narrow canyon that led to the old fortified silo, Mercer's only viable defensive position within striking distance. Inside his chest, Jonah carried the weight of responsibility like a physical presence, heavier than the girl herself. Every breath, every step, every calculation was measured to preserve her fragile life. He could feel her small, clammy hand press against his back whenever he stumbled. The first skirmish had been merciless. Exposing a weakness in the militia's approach, they underestimated the terrain, the man, and the sheer unpredictability of the desert itself. But now, regrouped and unseen, they could attack in numbers and with heavier tech. Mercer's mind churned through tactical contingencies, supply limitations, and the minimal communications bandwidth he had. One misstep, one misread of wind direction or vehicle placement, and the night would claim them both. Jonah, Laya whispered into the comm, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. I've got multiple heat signatures moving parallel to your path, 50 meters off your 6 o'clock. They're silent, disciplined, likely scouts. You're not clear yet. Jonah adjusted his pace, the girls swaying slightly with each motion. He scanned the darkened horizon, noting faint glints of reflective surfaces, subtle disturbances in the sand, and the low hum of distant mechanical equipment. The scouts moved with precision, their training evident in the almost imperceptible rhythm of their patrol. He considered an ambush, but quickly realized that the open space offered him no true cover. Attempting to engage would expose both him and the girl. Instead, he needed a distraction, something to fragment their cohesion long enough to reach cover. Laya's drones shifted silently, emitting pulses that warped infrared imaging and occasionally letting off brief electromagnetic bursts. Mercer had trained alongside engineers before, enough to know that disrupting a sensor net, even temporarily, could create chaos among disciplined units. He counted steps, timed his bursts of movement, and relied on shadows to cloak his advance. The scouts reacted almost immediately, scanning, recalculating, but the desert was his ally. Subtle changes in terrain, dust and heat shimmer allowed him to mask momentum in ways technology alone could not anticipate. He slipped behind a jutting boulder, setting the girl down for a brief moment, her face buried against his chest as he whispered, "Almost there. Stay quiet." He moved around the rock, brushing away loose sand to expose an old trail that led into the canyon. The scouts paused, alerted by the disturbance. Mercer allowed Laya's drones to flare intermittently, drawing their attention before cutting the bursts abruptly. The enemy's line of sight faltered. The advantage was fleeting but sufficient. They reached the canyon's mouth, a tight crevasse that funneled movement into a single choke point. Here, the narrow walls provided natural cover and defensive leverage, but they also amplified the sound of approaching vehicles and footsteps. Mercer felt the weight of each decision. One poorly timed sprint, one miscalculated echo, could betray their position. He set the girl behind a rocky outcrop, partially hidden while he scouted ahead. Her breathing was steady, but he knew the faint rhythm of fear in her chest. Laya's voice crackled through the comm. "Jonah, we've got reports of a heavier force moving south of your position. Looks like artillery drones and possibly armored vehicles. Their movement is synchronized, not random. Someone's directing them command and control intact." Mercer's mind raced, calculating time to impact, energy constraints on the drones, reload cycles of their kinetic disruptors, and the probability of encountering obstacles in the canyon. He could not engage directly. The girl's safety was paramount. Yet retreating wasn't viable. Either North Ridge was blocked, East Gully was a kill zone, and the southern approach was already contested. Improvisation was the only option. He mapped a route that leveraged the canyon's natural overhangs and pre-existing mining tunnels, shallow but sufficient to conceal movement. Laya would provide overwatch, targeting any hostiles that strayed into line of sight. The first enemy drone passed overhead, its sensors flicking in a calculated sweep. Mercer held his breath as the beam washed across the canyon floor. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the second drone, slower and less precise, signaled a momentary lapse. Mercer seized it, sprinting to the next rock outcrop, lungs burning, muscles screaming. Laya's drone cast a narrow beam to disrupt pursuit as he moved, forcing the scouts to pause, giving him precious seconds. The canyon deepened, shadows thickening. Mercer had memorized its twists and turns over years of reconnaissance. He counted steps to avoid disorientation, whispered coordinates to Laya, who repositioned drones with surgical precision to provide intermittent cover and surveillance. Even with all this, a sudden crash echoed from behind them, a small rock slide triggered by enemy scouts. Jonah froze, calculating. He could sprint through and risk exposure, or attempt to divert the scouts with improvised measures. He opted for a distraction. Pulling a small thermal flare from his vest, he lobbed it into a side crevice. The flare ignited, casting an intense, fluctuating glow that mimicked movement. Sand shifted and dust rose as the scout sensors recalibrated, buying Jonah another 10 seconds to move the girl farther into cover. The flare's heat signature mimicked life. The scouts reacted predictably, following the decoy rather than focusing on the canyon floor. Good work, Laya muttered, almost imperceptibly, though the praise was for both of them. Mercer allowed himself a brief nod before pressing forward. The canyon bent sharply, and at the apex, an old rail line from the mining days provided a narrow platform above a sheer drop. He estimated the structural integrity, cracks, rust, and erosion, but calculated it could bear their weight if he moved quickly. There was no margin for error. He set the girl down again, whispering, "We cross fast." "Hold on." Her grip tightened around his neck. Mercer led, moving with deliberate precision, boots finding every stable anchor point. Dust fell from the aged timber, a warning, but they advanced, Laya providing flanking overwatch from above. Halfway across, the first rail support creaked ominously. Mercer froze, scanning the air and canyon for threats. A drone, unseen until now, hovered silently above, scanning. He needed Laya to disrupt it without giving away his exact position. "Now," he hissed. Laya's pulse jammer flared, the drone shuddering as its systems flickered. It veered slightly, giving Mercer the critical seconds needed. He shifted his weight, keeping low, and continued. The last rail section was weak, but stable enough to bear them onto solid ground on the far side. They emerged into a small clearing where he had cached supplies, water, medical kits, and energy cells. The girl slumped against him, exhaustion evident in every shudder of her body. Mercer's hands were steady as he checked her for injuries, minor abrasions, a faint bruise on her temple, but no broken bones. Relief passed quickly. They were safe only for the moment. Laya's voice sounded from above, sharp now with urgency. "Jonah, they've adapted. Scout drones have recalibrated. Additional units are converging on your last location. You're no longer invisible. Time's critical." Jonah absorbed the words, his mind racing through the calculus of survival. Supplies were finite. The canyon offered defensive advantage, but only if they held it temporarily. He had to lure the enemy into disadvantageous positions while minimizing exposure to the girl. Every step forward was a negotiation with physics, terrain, and human ingenuity. He could not afford mistakes. Night deepened, swallowing the stars behind a sudden dust storm that whipped through the canyon, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The wind carried the shrill cries of distant animals, echoes of mechanical whines, and the faint metallic hiss of distant engines. It was perfect for concealment, but treacherous. Footing became uncertain, and the sound of approaching forces could be masked or distorted. Mercer took advantage. Moving methodically through shadows and dust eddies, he paused at a narrow choke point, placing small caltrops scavenged from old mining equipment to slow pursuit. Laya's drones continued to harry the enemy, creating false heat signatures and brief bursts of AM interference. Mercer positioned the girl behind him, ensuring she remained hidden and insulated from both physical and psychological threats. He whispered instructions to her, grounding her fear with clarity, repetition, and measured calm. Minutes stretched, then hours as the enemy adapted. Their patrols became more disciplined, more aggressive, but each foray revealed subtle patterns, exploitable weaknesses. Mercer cataloged them: the tendency to overcommit to sensor readings, reliance on linear pursuit, delayed communication due to jammers, and predictable retreat paths. Every observation informed his next move dot by dawn. The first casualties of attrition appeared among the enemy scouts, caught in improvised traps and diverted paths. Mercer allowed himself no celebration. Each success came at a cost: exertion, exposure, and dwindling energy. Laya's presence was critical. Without her technological edge, they could not have survived this long. Yet even with her, the broader threat remained. Whoever had orchestrated the initial hanging was patient, ruthless, and always several steps ahead as the first light of day brushed the canyon walls. Mercer surveyed the perimeter. The girl, now slumped asleep from sheer exhaustion, was safe for the moment. He allowed himself a brief glance at Laya, who returned a nod that carried the weight of shared understanding. Survival required constant adaptation, ruthless calculation, and willingness to sacrifice comfort, safety, and certainty. But before relief could settle, the canyon floor vibrated faintly. A sound not quite mechanical, not quite natural a harbinger. Mercer froze. Laya's drone flitted upward, sensors scanning. The enemy's main force was mobilizing, larger than predicted, moving with synchronization that suggested command presence. The scout skirmishes had been only a probe, a test. The real battle was coming. Jonah tightened his grip on the girl, setting his jaw against fatigue. "Get ready," he muttered. The canyon's shadows deepened, the wind howling through narrow passages. He could feel the desert itself bracing with him. The next move would define whether they survived the day or became another brutal lesson carved into the sand. And then, from the far end of the canyon, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the rising sun. Clad in black tactical armor, the presence radiated command. Every step was deliberate, measured. Jonah's pulse quickened. This was no scout, no ordinary militia leader. Whoever stood there controlled the flow of the approaching assault. The calculus had changed. He whispered to Laya, barely audible, "They know we're here. And they're coming for everything." The figure raised a hand, signaling movements across the canyon floor. The earth trembled faintly as mechanized vehicles emerged behind it, cutting off escape routes and channeling Jonah and the girl toward a trap meticulously laid out. The desert, which had been a tool and ally, now seemed to conspire against them. Jonah Mercer inhaled, felt the girl press closer, and prepared for the gambit that would define the battle to come. Survival required ingenuity, courage, and ruthless precision, and they had none of it to spare. The canyon shook as the mechanized column advanced, the ground vibrating beneath Jonah Mercer's boots. Dust and sand swirled into the air, forming a murky curtain that both concealed and betrayed movements. The girl clung to his back, her small arms wrapping around his shoulders as he calculated every step forward. Laya Voss hovered above on her camo-shielded hoverbike, drones darting around the approaching force like swarming metallic insects, scanning for weaknesses and relaying intelligence in near real time. The enemy's command figure, a shadowed silhouette against the pale morning light, directed units with precise, almost surgical gestures. This was no disorganized militia. This was a coalition of insurgents who had elevated asymmetric warfare into an art form, combining guerrilla cunning with technical ingenuity. Jonah knew he couldn't wait for them to close the canyon. Retreat was no longer viable. The entrances were blocked, and the mechanized force had mapped the terrain ahead with drones and forward observers. He had to take the initiative, exploit their overconfidence, and disrupt their cohesion before it became fatal. His mind raced through options, weighing the risks of exposure, structural collapse, and supply limits. Every ounce of his body, every year of solitary survival, screamed that speed, deception, and terrain mastery were their only allies. He led the girl to a narrow ledge above a natural choke point, a precipice that fell sharply into a dry riverbed. From here, he could channel enemy vehicles into unstable ground. Laia adjusted her position to provide overwatch and tactical drone control, emitting intermittent ME pulses to disrupt sensors. Jonah checked the girl, whispering reassurance while strapping her securely. Her eyes were wide, reflecting both fear and trust. The enemy approached, unaware of the trap. Jonah began improvising mechanical obstacles, debris from the old mining era, rusted rail segments, and sand-filled crates. He calculated load bearing, friction, and the collapse sequence. Timing was everything. The mechanized units moved in formation, confident, disciplined. Jonah read their patterns like a chessboard. The lead vehicle hit the first improvised ramp. The uneven weight shifted, the front wheels snapping the weak supports. A deafening metallic crunch echoed through the canyon. Dust and sand erupted, blinding the following vehicles and forcing them to brake abruptly. Jonah and Laia's trap had succeeded, but the enemy adapted quickly. Deploying infantry with tactical shields to flank the choke point, Jonah moved with practiced precision, using low cover to navigate along the ledge, directing Laia to focus drones on the approaching infantry. Shots rang out-controlled, precise, tactical suppressive fire. The insurgents advanced, but their momentum was broken, slowed by terrain and environmental hazards. Jonah noted patterns. They preferred to maintain formation, over-relying on communication relays that Laia intermittently jammed. Each disruption forced a predictable response. Creating exploitable gaps, they advanced further into the canyon's twisting paths. And Jonah realized the insurgents were herding them toward a dead-end mine passage leading into an old storage silo. Laia's cum crackled. They've anticipated your fallback. The silo is booby-trapped. Likely remote detonators. You need an alternative route now. Jonah's eyes scanned the canyon walls. There was a narrow fissure half hidden behind loose rock, leading to a network of pre-existing ventilation shafts from the mining era. Risky tight, unstable, potential for collapse, but it was the only viable alternative. He guided the girl toward the fissure, timing every step to avoid loose stones that could betray their movement. Laia flanked overhead, providing cover fire where sensors detected enemy scouts trying to encircle them. The insurgents reacted faster than expected. An elite operative, moving with silent precision, dropped from the ridge above into the fissure mouth. Jonah assessed immediately. One target, high risk. Engaging directly might trigger an alert to the remaining forces. He opted for deception. Using a small reflective panel from his pack, he created a fleeting diversion, making it appear that they had moved left while he guided the girl right. The operative hesitated, adjusting to the false feed. Giving Jonah critical seconds to enter the fissure dot inside, the air was thick, dusty, and suffocating. Shadows clung to the walls, and Jonah moved slowly, mindful of the unstable surfaces and rusted metal remnants. Each step required balance, control, and acute awareness. Laia maintained overwatch via drones above the fissure vents, projecting heat and M signatures to keep the enemy off balance. Jonah could hear the faint hum of vehicles outside, the distant chatter of insurgent units attempting to coordinate. Hours passed as they navigated the labyrinthine shafts, avoiding weak sections and collapsed tunnels. Jonah marked their path using a small thermal ink spray, ensuring they could backtrack if necessary. The girl, exhausted, finally whispered, "Are they gone?" Jonah didn't answer directly. He knew the enemy adapted quickly, and complacency was death. He simply replied, "Not yet. We move until we can see." The shafts opened into a hidden ravine, providing a temporary vantage point over enemy supply lines. Jonah studied the movement of convoys, drones, and infantry. Patterns emerged. Fuel distribution was limited, resupply slow, and their COM network, though encrypted, had latency that could be exploited. Laya's drones relayed encrypted bursts, revealing the positions of heavier units and unmanned artillery. Jonah formulated a plan, a small-scale raid to cripple supply lines, gather intelligence, and create confusion, allowing them to reclaim initiative. He spotted the first opportunity, a narrow ledge above the canyon floor that could serve as a pressure point. A small explosion here would trigger a landslide, channeling the mechanized units into a bottleneck while simultaneously masking the approach of the girl and Laya. He checked the slope's integrity, calculated debris trajectory, and rigged charges with meticulous care. Mindful that a miscalculation could be fatal for all three of them, Laya confirmed her drone positions and sensor sweeps, ready to provide instantaneous feedback. The moment came. Jonah triggered the charges remotely, and the canyon erupted in controlled chaos. Dust and debris fell like a curtain of stone, disorienting the mechanized column below. The vehicles struggled to maintain traction, wheels slipping over loose rock, engines straining. Infantry units surged forward to compensate, but Laya's drones, projecting false thermal signatures and M interference, forced them into misaligned formations. Jonah seized the moment, sprinting with the girl to a secondary gorge passage. While small fires and smoke obscured their movements, but the insurgent command figure had anticipated some level of disruption. From above, a sniper operative opened fire with precision rounds designed to disable without risk of collateral damage to the terrain. Jonah moved with calculated unpredictability, using terrain masking, dust, and Laya's drone interference to evade lethal contact. Each movement was deliberate, a blend of survival instinct and tactical calculation honed from years of isolation. The girl's grip on him tightened, but he maintained a calm cadence in his steps. Whispering instructions and grounding her fear, they reached a concealed alcove where Jonah could catch his breath and reassess. Laya hovered above, reporting on enemy adaptation. New units were mobilizing along the ridges, suggesting a coordinated attempt to encircle them. Jonah recognized the opportunity. If he could isolate the command figure's position, disrupt communication nodes, and bait the inner circle into overextension, they could turn the tide. Laya relayed potential routes for infiltration and attack, factoring in terrain, line of sight, and enemy sensor patterns. Jonah set the girl down briefly, checking for injuries, minor abrasions, fatigue, but no critical wounds. He whispered reassurance and instructed her to remain silent and still while he advanced. Laya's drones provided overhead suppression, targeting communication relays and creating diversions. Jonah moved with fluid precision, using the canyon's irregularities to mask approach. Every step was calculated to minimize exposure, exploiting shadows and natural cover. The command figure's forward observation post was lightly defended, relying on drone coverage for perimeter security. Jonah moved into position, using a combination of environmental awareness, improvised camouflage, and Laya's drone feeds to navigate undetected. He planted small charges at structural weak points and prepared an electronic disruption device to disable communications temporarily. Timing was critical. Detonate too early and the enemy could regroup. Too late and the figure would escape. The moment arrived. Jonah triggered the electronic pulse, followed by the charges. The observation post erupted in controlled destruction, masking his approach as he closed the distance. The command figure reacted, emerging with tactical armor and advanced weaponry. Jonah assessed the engagement. Direct confrontation was risky but unavoidable. He used a combination of calculated suppressive fire, terrain manipulation, and psychological pressure to isolate the figure from supporting units. The firefight was brief but intense. Jonah exploited weaknesses in the figure's positioning and reaction time, forcing a retreat into a confined section of the gorge. Laia coordinated drones to block potential escape routes and provide surveillance. Jonah pressed forward, using momentum, terrain, and precision to neutralize threats without unnecessary risk to the girl. Each step was a calculated gambit, blending strategy and improvisation. As the dust settled, the command figure, wounded but alive, was captured. Jonah secured the area, verifying that the insurgents' immediate threat had been neutralized. Laia monitored remaining units, identifying disorganized patrols retreating into the canyon's outer reaches. Supplies were low, fatigue was mounting, but the immediate danger had been contained. The girl remained unharmed, her trust in Jonah solidified through shared adversity, but victory came at a cost. During the operation, a critical section of the canyon had collapsed, severing one escape route and leaving several insurgent units unaccounted for. Jonah and Laia recognized that further engagements were inevitable. The mold's identity remained unknown, and the intelligence indicated other cells remained active. Poised to capitalize on any lapse in vigilance, Jonah adjusted his strategy, consolidating forces and fortifying their temporary position. Laia's drones continued surveillance and jamming, while Jonah set traps and improvised defenses along the canyon's access points. The girl rested, but Jonah remained alert, aware that the desert offered no permanent sanctuary. Every tactical advantage was temporary. Every moment of respite required vigilance and preparation. As evening descended, Jonah surveyed the canyon. The insurgents were regrouping, their movements deliberate but slowed by confusion and environmental disruption. Laia confirmed that supply lines had been compromised, drones disabled, and communication nodes disrupted. Yet the inner circle remained at large, adaptive and dangerous. Jonah realized that the decisive battle was approaching, one that would require not just strategy and technology, but personal courage and sacrifice. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the faint hum of approaching units from multiple vectors. Jonah tightened his grip on the girl, eyes scanning the horizon. Laia adjusted drones, projecting false signatures and preparing electronic countermeasures. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not without advantage: terrain mastery, tactical ingenuity, and the element of unpredictability remained on their side. Jonah took a deep breath, centering his focus. The canyon stretched ahead, shadowed and uncertain, but within it lay opportunity. The command figure's capture had turned the enemy's attention inward, creating openings for further tactical maneuvers. Every decision, every calculated risk, would determine whether they survived the next phase or became another brutal lesson carved into the desert floor. He looked at the girl, her small form trembling but alive. "We're not done," he whispered. "Not by a long shot." Above them, Laia's drones flickered, scanning for movement. The desert held its breath, the canyon waiting, as the decisive engagement loomed. Jonah's mind raced, plotting every vector, every contingency, every sacrifice that might be necessary. And then, in the deepening shadows, a figure emerged from the ridge, watching, calculating, preparing to tip the balance once more. Jonah's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary adversary. The final confrontation, the one that would define survival, strategy, and the cost of mercy, was about to begin. The morning sun rose like a pale sentinel over the jagged canyon ridges, casting long shadows that twisted and shifted with the terrain. Jonah Mercer crouched on a narrow ledge, the girl secured against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Laia Voss hovered above, drones weaving intricate patterns through the thin morning air, feeding real-time data, mapping enemy positions, and projecting false heat signatures to mask their movements. The insurgent command figure they had captured the previous night was secured with a combination of restraints and tech locks, his tactical armor compromised and communication devices disabled. Yet Jonah knew that the deeper threat remained. the mole within the insurgents. Ranks and the remaining inner circle had not yet been neutralized. Jonah reviewed the terrain from their perch, studying the canyon below where scattered insurgent forces were regrouping. Supply convoys remained stalled, vehicles disabled by previous raids, and drones downed or scrambled. The command figure had been bait. He and the girl were now the centerpiece of a broader confrontation, one that would decide not just survival, but the operational fate of the insurgents in this region. Laya relayed the intel. Multiple units were advancing along predicted vectors, but Jonah had calculated a multi-phase plan one last gambit to finish the operation decisively. Time is tight, Laya said, her voice clipped through the comms. If they adjust to our patterns, we lose the element of surprise. You've got one clean window. Jonah adjusted the girl, whispering reassurances, then scanned the canyon for weak points. There were 3 paths of approach for the insurgent reinforcements: the main canyon floor, a high ridge to the east, and a partially collapsed mining outpost to the west. Each had vulnerabilities. The main floor was narrow and unstable. The ridge exposed units to sniper and drone fire, and the mining outpost could be rigged to collapse. Jonah envisioned synchronized triggers, timed precisely, that would divide the enemy and force them into kill zones. He initiated the first phase. Laya deployed drones to project false movements along the canyon floor, drawing attention while Jonah rigged charges along the eastern ridge, calculated to trigger rockfalls. Small, improvised kinetic devices from the mining remnants were placed to delay infantry movements, designed to buy seconds and create openings. The girl's presence required careful planning. Every explosive had to be isolated and remotely triggered to ensure her safety. The enemy advanced cautiously, scanning with drones and infrared sensors. He selected 4 target convoys, timing the assault with Laya's drone interference. Using thermal cloaks and terrain masking, Jonah approached with the girl secured in a makeshift carrier, moving silently along ridges. Explosives were limited. Precision was necessary. He planted small charges at critical points: wheel hubs, fuel lines, and sensor arrays. Laya coordinated the detonation sequence with synchronized EMA bursts to prevent remote overrides. The explosions rippled through the convoy, setting off fires, disabling vehicles, and creating chaos. Insurgents scrambled, trying to regroup, but Jonah's strategic positioning allowed overwatch from hidden perches, striking opportunistically. Laya's drones provided constant intel, warning of flanking units and creating false heat signatures to mislead the enemy. The insurgent command figure appeared on the ridge, assessing the damage. Jonah realized a full confrontation was inevitable, but for now, their disarray was advantageous. In the midst of chaos, Jonah encountered an unexpected complication. One of the insurgent officers, previously assumed dead in the initial ambush, emerged from cover, targeting the girl. Jonah reacted instinctively, using a rock slide to sever the officer's line of sight. Laya fired precision rounds to disable the operative's exosuit, halting pursuit. Jonah rushed to the girl, shielding her from debris, and pressed forward, adrenaline and fear driving every movement. After retreating to a temporary safe zone, Jonah examined the intel gathered from the raid. Communications logs indicated another layer of command, an inner circle coordinating multiple militia cells across the region. One encrypted file, partially decrypted by Laya, revealed that a trusted ally within the local resistance had betrayed them, feeding intelligence to the insurgents. Jonah's stomach turned. The battle was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding the depth of the conspiracy that had targeted the girl. "We've been compromised," Jonah muttered. Laya's drones hovered close, scanning for residual threats. Someone knew we were here before we arrived. The hanging was a lure. The girl stirred, eyes wide with comprehension. They wanted me," she whispered. Jonah held her close, understanding that her presence had been the catalyst. But the implications were broader territory, technology, leverage. The insurgents weren't random. They were strategic, ruthless, and willing to exploit human cost to achieve objectives. Jonah formulated a counter gambit. Using the intel, they could intercept insurgent supply lines, gather evidence of the betrayal, and possibly lure the command figure into overextending. Laya agreed, noting the risks. Any miscalculation could isolate them entirely, leaving them vulnerable to annihilation. Supplies were finite, fatigue was high, and the desert offered no quarter. Yet inaction was not an option. The enemy had momentum, and hesitation equaled death. As night fell again, Jonah prepared for a high-risk offensive. The girl, though frightened, trusted him implicitly. Laya deployed drones to create a network of false signatures, thermal decoys, and intermittent impulses. Jonah plotted routes over ridges, across dry riverbeds, and through abandoned outposts, timing movement with environmental cover, shadow, and sound masking. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. The first phase of the raid commenced. Jonah targeted supply caches, utilizing explosives, collapsing weak structures, and employing guerrilla tactics honed over years of isolation. Laya coordinated overwatch and electronic warfare, blinding the enemy to his movements while relaying critical intel. The insurgents responded with precision, but the chaos from simultaneous attacks fractured their cohesion. Jonah's understanding of terrain and the enemy's predictable adaptations allowed him to exploit openings, disrupt supply chains, and extract critical communication nodes. Just as the operation seemed under control, disaster struck. An unexpected detachment, previously undetected due to a blind spot in the canyon's thermal signature, ambushed them from above. Laya's drones detected movement too late. The girl screamed as debris and fire erupted around them. Jonah reacted instantly, shielding her, returning fire, and retreating to cover. The ambush was precise. Surgical, someone within the insurgent command had anticipated their tactics. Jonah realized, with a chilling certainty, that the betrayal ran deeper than they feared. The inner circle had a mole feeding live intel, predicting movements, and orchestrating ambushes. Every tactical advantage gained so far was fragile, contingent on deception, improvisation, and split-second timing. The battle was no longer solely about survival or rescue. It was about unraveling a conspiracy embedded within the insurgents' ranks. Identifying the traitor and using that knowledge to turn the tide. As the dust settled, Jonah and Laya were grouped with the girl in a hidden outpost. Supplies were depleted, fatigue was high, and injuries, though minor, signaled the human cost of their offensive. Jonah studied the canyon floor, calculating the enemy's likely next move, knowing that the insurgents would adjust, reinforce, and strike back with lethal efficiency. And then a new transmission pinged on Laya's encrypted channel, a message from the mole. The words were brief, chilling, and uncompromising. "We know your position. Stop or she dies. Your time is running out." Jonah's heart sank. The trap had widened. The betrayal was no longer a shadow, it was a clear, immediate threat. Every decision from this point forward would carry amplified consequences. Laya's drones flickered above, a last line of defense, but the odds were shifting dangerously. Jonah glanced at the girl, whose small hand rested on his arm, a silent plea for protection. He inhaled sharply, setting his jaw. Survival, extraction, justice, everything depended on their next move. The insurgent command figure emerged again, this time closer, observing the canyon's chaos with an almost casual menace. Jonah realized that the coming confrontation would require not just tactical brilliance, but audacity, cunning, and sacrifices that would test the limits of endurance. The desert wind howled, carrying dust and whispers of the approaching storm. Jonah tightened his grip on the girl, eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere in the chaos, the traitor awaited. And beyond that, the command figure's full force was mobilizing. The next battle would decide everything. The first light of dawn cut through the dusty haze of the ravine, painting the canyon walls in harsh, almost sterile gold. Jonah Mercer crouched behind a fractured rock formation, the girl strapped securely to his back while Laya Voss hovered above, drones flitting silently like ghosts over the jagged terrain. The ambushes of the previous night had left their mark: minor injuries, depleted ammunition, and frayed nerves. But the stakes had escalated far beyond survival. The insurgent command figure was now fully aware of their presence, and the mole's warning, "We know your position. Stop or she dies," hung like a guillotine over every decision. Time was no longer a line but a trap, and every move had to be precise. Jonah scanned the canyon floor, tracing patterns in the enemy's formations. Vehicles had repositioned into overlapping fields of fire, drones hovered with persistent surveillance, and infantry units moved in coordinated sweeps, predictable yet lethal in execution. Laya's drones provided intermittent cover, jamming sensors and creating false heat signatures, but the enemy had begun adapting, compensating for interference with sophisticated algorithms. Jonah's mind worked furiously, mapping variables, calculating probabilities, anticipating overcompensation. He realized that the only chance they had was to force the enemy into overextension, using the terrain itself as a weapon while exploiting the gaps created by their confidence and reliance on tech. He led the girl to a narrow crevice that descended sharply into a hidden gorge. The terrain was treacherous. Loose stones threatened footing, and the walls were slick with centuries of erosion. Yet this was the only multi-vector path they could use. By splitting the assault, sending false signals, creating the illusion of presence in multiple locations, they could disperse the enemy, diluting the effectiveness of the mechanized units and infantry. Laya understood instantly, coordinating drones to project thermal decoys along the canyon rim while emitting M bursts to create momentary sensor blackouts. As they descended, Jonah noticed faint disturbances in the sand, tracks indicating that a small insurgent advance unit had already attempted to secure the gorge. Laya's analysis confirmed it. They were preparing a blocking force. Jonah gritted his teeth. This was no longer merely a tactical problem, it was psychological warfare. Every hesitation, every visible motion could be exploited. He whispered to the girl, keeping her calm, grounding her in breath and presence. Her wide eyes reflected both fear and trust, a combination that Jonah had learned to respect, but also had to leverage for their survival. At the bottom of the gorge, Jonah used the jagged rock formations to establish a temporary defensive perimeter. Laya's drones darted overhead, transmitting live data and providing intermittent fire support when the insurgent scouts approached. Jonah positioned the girl behind a protective wall of rocks and abandoned mining debris, then surveyed the gorge for offensive opportunities. The insurgents were advancing in two primary vectors, one along the canyon floor, armored and mechanized, another flanking from higher elevation, relying on drones and sniper-like precision. Jonah needed to force them into a trap where terrain and timing would neutralize both advantages simultaneously. Jonah calculated timing to the millisecond, synchronizing his triggers with Laya's interference bursts. A single misstep could expose them both to lethal fire. The first charges detonated, sending a controlled avalanche down the eastern ridge. Insurgent units were forced to reposition, vehicles stalled, and drones scrambled. Laya's aim pulses blinded their sensor feed, creating temporary chaos. Jonah moved with precision, navigating over narrow ledges and through hidden shafts to reach the second stage position. The mining outpost, now repurposed as a trap, was Jonah's next focus. He placed charges at structural weak points and rigged collapsible supports to create an instant choke point. Laya's drones hovered above, projecting thermal decoys and jamming the enemy's short-range sensors. The insurgents advanced into the narrow entrance of the outpost, unaware of the imminent collapse. Jonah triggered the sequence, and the structure groaned and fell, partially sealing the entry while forcing the enemy into a compressed kill zone. Amid the chaos, the insurgent inner circle attempted to rally, coordinating from hidden positions on the canyon rim. Jonah's sensors, fed by Laya's drones, identified the command nodes. Using a combination of long-range kinetic disruptors and targeted M-bursts, he severed communication links, isolating the units below and fracturing command cohesion. Insurgent forces moved erratically, overcompensating for perceived threats and failing to coordinate effectively. Jonah pressed forward, his focus absolute. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to maximize the terrain's natural advantages while minimizing risk to the girl. Laya guided him through hidden shafts and narrow ledges, projecting data on enemy positions, escape routes, and potential hazards. The insurgents, disoriented and divided, began to fall into pre-planned zones where concentrated kinetic and electronic disruption would have maximum effect. Jonah deployed small, precise charges to disable remaining vehicles and create impassable obstacles, effectively bottlenecking any potential counterattack. Then, a single figure emerged, a sharpshooter from the inner circle, perched high above on a rocky outcrop, line of sight fixed directly on the girl. Jonah's heart pounded. Laya detected the shot milliseconds before the trigger. Jonah reacted instantly, using the canyon's natural curvature and rock cover to obscure the girl's silhouette, simultaneously directing a focused drone pulse to scramble the shooter's targeting optics. A single precise maneuver combining terrain, timing, and technology neutralized the immediate threat without endangering the girl. With the upper threat suppressed, Jonah advanced to the isolated remnants of the insurgent command. Using a combination of intimidation, strategic positioning, and overwhelming display of environmental and technological advantage, he compelled the command figure to surrender fully. The insurgent leader, aware that all avenues of escape were blocked and further resistance would be futile, yielded, providing critical information on remaining cells and the mole within their ranks. Jonah extracted the data using a secure field interface, confirming the mole's identity and the extent of the betrayal. Laya cross-referenced movement logs, decrypted partial comms, and mapped supply lines. They now possessed enough intelligence to neutralize remaining insurgent networks without unnecessary engagement. The girl, trembling but safe, watched from a distance, a silent witness to the culmination of relentless tactical ingenuity. As they prepared to extract, the insurgent units attempted one final coordinated strike, a desperate gambit from forces that had survived the canyon's devastation. Jonah anticipated the move, using terrain masking, sensor feedback, and precise timing to channel them into pre-prepared zones. EM pulses, kinetic disruption, and carefully timed detonations fractured their formations, disabling vehicles and scattering infantry. Laya's drones executed targeted EMP strikes, neutralizing remaining drones and electronic support systems. The insurgents' last attempt at organized resistance crumbled under pressure. Jonah moved methodically, securing the girl and ensuring no hazards remained along the extraction route. Laya projected environmental scans, confirming the canyon's perimeter was clear. Supplies were nearly depleted, and fatigue pressed hard on both of them, but operational discipline remained intact. Every trap, every calculation, every sacrifice had coalesced into a controlled endgame. Finally, Jonah and Laya guided the girl to a hidden ridge overlooking the canyon exit where an extraction vehicle awaited. The insurgent command figure, restrained and subdued, was loaded aboard. Laya coordinated flight paths, sensor sweeps, and electronic countermeasures to ensure a safe departure from the canyon. Jonah took a moment to survey the scene, the debris of tactical ingenuity, the destroyed vehicles, and the fractured insurgent units, a testament to the human cost of survival and strategy. As the extraction craft lifted off, Jonah felt the first real moment of relief. The girl, exhausted but unharmed, leaned against him, her small hand gripping his jacket. Laya hovered nearby, drones retracting as the craft ascended, eyes scanning the horizon for lingering threats. Below, the desert stretched endlessly, the canyon a scar carved by tactical brilliance and human resilience. Jonah knew the cost had been high. Supplies, exhaustion, and moral compromise weighed heavily. But the operation had succeeded. The girl was safe, the insurgent command neutralized, and the mole identified. The lessons were clear: human ingenuity, adaptability, and discipline could overcome overwhelming force. But the price was always steep. As the craft soared above the canyon, Jonah reflected on the endurance required, the trust forged between him and Laya, the silent resilience of the girl, and the grim calculus of every decision made under pressure. The desert below seemed to acknowledge their victory with an indifferent wind, as if nature itself had tested them, and for now. A loud passage. The girl spoke softly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the engines. "You saved me." Jonah looked down at her, a faint smile touching his lips despite the exhaustion. "No," he said quietly. "We survived, together. That's what matters." Above them, Laya activated the final set of scans, ensuring no remaining threats persisted along the extraction corridor. Jonah allowed himself a long breath, feeling the tension release slowly, fully aware that while this battle had been won, the desert, the insurgents, and the unpredictable calculus of human conflict would demand vigilance again. The craft turned toward the horizon, rising above the canyon walls, leaving behind the scarred battlefield and the echoes of conflict. Jonah watched the desert stretch out endlessly, the sun reflecting off sand and stone. The girl rested quietly, her trust and resilience emblematic of human fragility and courage. Laya's drones hummed softly, a reminder that technology and human will had blended to create survival. In that moment, Jonah Mercer allowed himself to recognize the truth of what they had achieved. Survival was not merely avoidance of death, it was a series of calculated risks, improvised tactics, and sacrifices made in the crucible of relentless pressure. Every choice mattered. Every action had consequences. And though the canyon behind them bore the scars of conflict, it also stood as a testament to human ingenuity, discipline, and the enduring drive to protect those who could not protect themselves. As the craft disappeared over the horizon, the desert wind carried a final whisper of acknowledgement. Jonah knew that their story, the story of survival, of tactical brilliance, and of unwavering human resolve, was etched into the sands, ready to inform and warn those who might come after. And somewhere in the distance, the insurgent networks would remember the lesson: underestimate ingenuity at your peril, and never mistake discipline and courage for weakness. The girl stirred, her eyes meeting Jonah's. For the first time in days, there was a spark of hope, unshaken by fear. Jonah nodded, understanding that the bonds forged through adversity were stronger than the forces arrayed against them. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the vast desert expanse, casting long shadows behind them. The battle was over, but the lessons remained. Survival demanded vigilance, humanity, and relentless adaptation. Jonah Mercer, the girl, and Laya Voss had endured, and in doing so, had set the stage for a future defined not by fear, but by courage, strategy, and the enduring human spirit. And as the craft carried them away from the canyon, the desert seemed to breathe again, indifferent yet alive, bearing witness to the conclusion of a story that would ripple far beyond its sands, a story of sacrifice, discipline, and the unwavering drive to protect life against overwhelming odds.